Chapter 1 Island of the Sky Kings. I have lived my entire life on the island city of Tayasal, a place that rises gently from the water like a memory refusing to shed its past. The lake surrounding it, Itza, forms a vast shimmering cradle that reflects the moods of sky and season more faithfully than any codex. Each morning when I ascend the steps to the House of Instruments, the observatory where I serve, I watch the first colors of the day spread across the water, fanning out in slow ripples as if the lake itself were waking from a long ancestral dream. The world here appears unchanging to an untrained eye, but nothing in Tayasal is static. The island hums with the lives of thousands. From the elevated plaza, I watch farmers pole their canoes toward the markets, their vessels heavy with maize, squash, cacao, and woven mats dyed with ochre and indigo. Smoke rises from hearths in slender blue ribbons that catch the light as the sun climbs. Children run along plastered pathways lined with shrines. Priests sweep the temple steps before the first offerings of the day are laid. The regularity of these actions has the cadence of a heartbeat, and it is within this steady rhythm that the life of the kingdom moves. As a court astronomer, I occupy a position that is both humble and essential. The kings of the Khan-Ek lineage, who have ruled this island capital longer than written memory, rely on those of us in the House of Instruments to track celestial patterns with unfailing precision. We measure not only the sun's course and the timing of eclipses, but the more delicate intervals of Venus, whose cycles govern ritual, agriculture, diplomacy, and, in older eras, war. Our codices record centuries of observation, and the faithfulness of our measurements ties the present to the past as surely as any lineage stone or carved serpent frieze. The observatory is not grand in outward appearance. It is a squat, sturdy structure of limestone blocks covered in a smooth plaster that gleams faintly under the sun. Within, narrow windows cut through the walls at specific angles, each aligned to a celestial event, the solstice sunrise, the zenith passage of the sun, the first appearance of Venus as morning star. These windows are our instruments as much as the cords, plumb lines, and sighting staffs we use daily. The building itself forms part of the machinery of measurement, designed to embody the mathematics of sky and earth. My daily tasks are meticulous. I rise before dawn to measure the position of Venus, or the faint arc of the moon if its phase allows visibility. I record the changing length of shadows cast by the gnomon pillar in the courtyard. I examine the codices, some copied by my own hand, others by scribes long deceased, comparing the old tables with current readings. The smallest deviation must be noted, the slightest irregularity traced. The Itza believe time is not a straight path, but a woven mat of cycles. The accuracy of each strand determines the coherence of the whole. The kingdom functions on this principle. Khan-Ek, the current ruler of Tayasal, upholds tradition with a composure that reflects the entire weight of his lineage. His authority is not expressed through extravagance, but through continuity. He occupies the position once held by countless ancestors, and he carries their burden with a manner that allows no weakness and yet no harshness. His presence in the palace halls is marked not by display, but by an unwavering steadiness. When he walks the plazas, people bow not out of fear, but out of recognition.
He stands at the center of the cycles that guide our world. It was during one of my routine dawn measurements that the first sign of change revealed itself. I had positioned myself at the eastern observation window, the horizon still dark except for the faintest glow building behind the ridge. Venus was due to rise. I checked the codex to confirm the expected interval, a number that had remained consistent for generations. The air was cool enough to mist my breath. Then, with the measured calm one learns through years of careful watching, I sighted the star as it emerged. Yet its angle, its timing, small details invisible to most, did not fully align with the long-standing tables. The deviation was slight, a whisper of difference rather than a shout, but unmistakable. I measured again, then a third time, and each result confirmed the same. Venus had arrived early. Such an occurrence is not unprecedented. Atmospheric conditions, distant storms, or even subtle shifts in air clarity can create the appearance of altered timing. But these are factors we know, patterns we understand. And the sky, though immense, is disciplined. Deviations appear, but rarely without context. The context now was absent.
I recorded the reading with precise glyphs and brought it to my mentor, the older astronomer who had served kings before Aj Khan Ek. He read the notation with a slow, practiced eye, tracing the interval marks with a fingertip. His silence extended long enough to confirm my suspicion. This was not trivial. He did not question the measurement. In our field, precision earns trust. The reading was delivered to the palace. The king examined the record with the same calm he applied to all matters. There was no alarm in his demeanor, only the quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted, and that knowledge required further observation. No pronouncement was made, no ritual ordered. The Khan Ek lineage responds first with contemplation. In the days that followed, the rhythm of Tayasal continued. The markets bustled, ceremonies proceeded, and the lake remained its usual mirror. Yet, as I made subsequent measurements, the deviation persisted. Not large, but consistent. A pattern emerging where none should be. The sky recorded something the earth had not yet revealed. At the same time, subtle stories began drifting inland along the trade routes from the east. Fishermen reported distant glimmers on the open sea, lights that did not correspond to known coastal fires or atmospheric reflections. Traders mentioned driftwood, not native to our forests, found among the reeds of their inlets. These stories were not yet troubling, but they accumulated like dust on the edge of a codex, sparing at first, then noticeable. I brought the matter to Hach Kin, who listened thoughtfully before suggesting that I travel to the coast to verify the accounts directly. Aj Khan Ek, upon hearing the proposal, agreed without hesitation. Observation demands proximity. If the sky and the sea were echoing one another in their anomalies, then both required examination. Thus began the journey that would carry me away from the familiar geometry of Tayasal's plazas into the broader, less stable landscape of the eastern territories. The trail led through dense forests whose leaf canopy filtered sunlight into shifting mosaics. We passed small villages perched on elevated ground, their architecture adapted to the floods that came every rainy season. Each community greeted us with wary curiosity, for we carried the king's seal and traveled with instruments rather than goods. The closer we came to the coast, the more the air changed. It grew thicker, saltier, tinged with the scent of mangroves and the distant breath of the sea. The inland hills flattened and waterways widened, leading eventually to the inlets where fishermen launched their canoes. I made astronomical observations along the way. The sun's angle here differed subtly from the interior, a reminder of how even short distances alter the geometry of shadows. I recorded each variation in the travel codex, noting the clarity of the horizon and the behavior of the light. These details matter, for measurement is never isolated. The landscape shapes the sky we see. When we reached the coastal village whose fishermen had been the first to speak of strange lights, I found the community attentive, not anxious. They described what they had seen without embellishment. Faint illumination near the deep water boundary, moving slowly over the waves. The descriptions carried the tone of observation rather than myth. Some presented fragments of pale driftwood with metal nails unlike those crafted by Maya hands. The wood bore the wear of the open sea. The nails carried a metallic weight we did not forge. I examined everything carefully. I measured the angles of the horizon from the edge of the reef. I recorded the behavior of the waves and the clarity of the dusk light. And one night, while standing on the shoreline, I saw the faint flicker of light myself, barely perceptible, but distinct. Returning to Tayasal with these findings, I felt the weight of what the evidence suggested. Something foreign had entered the waters near our world. Not a myth, not a metaphor. A presence carried by the sea, reflected subtly in the deviations of sky. Aj Khan Ek received the report with his characteristic composure. He did not summon panic, nor did he dismiss the findings. Instead, he convened councils, considering every possibility with a levelness that felt almost ceremonial. The Itza do not assume the worst. They assume the responsibility to understand. During this time, Tayasal remained outwardly unchanged. But I saw it differently now. The city's steady patterns, the markets, the rituals, the quiet movements of canoes, seemed like layers of sediment formed over a deep current I had only begun to sense. At night, as I worked in the House of Instruments copying measurements into the codex, I felt the boundary between the known and the unknown tighten around us. The sky continued to shift by small degrees. The lake, though calm, seemed to listen. The king watched both, with the steady precision of a lineage trained to interpret more than mere surfaces. This was the beginning of the turning, the first chapter of a bending cycle that none of us yet understood. Chapter 2. Rumors from the Great Water. The journey from Tayasal to the eastern coast traced a path that countless traders, hunters, ritual messengers, and diplomatic envoys had followed across generations, yet undertaking it as a royal astronomer with a mandate rooted not in commerce or ceremony, but in investigation, imparted a different gravity. What had begun as a subtle anomaly in Venus's ascent and a divergence in shadow angles had grown into a constellation of signs distributed across sky and water, and it fell to me to follow the chain to its edges. The House of Instruments teaches that observation does not end at familiar thresholds. When the world expands, the observer must expand with it. The morning we departed, the lake lay glass smooth beneath a thin layer of mist. The city was awake but subdued, as if sensing the nature of the king's directive without fully understanding its implications. Our canoes pushed gently from the island's landing, and Tayasal receded behind us. First the temples, then the residential districts, then the faint outline of the palace roof. Beyond the island, the world widened into a labyrinth of rivers, forests, and grassy wetlands, a terrain that resisted straight paths and insisted on slow understanding. Our retinue was small but sufficient. Seasoned guards whose familiarity with the land lent assurance to the journey. A trader who had traveled to the coast for decades and knew each settlement between lake and sea. A youth tasked with carrying provisions. And myself, unarmed, except for my staff and measuring tools, but carrying the king's seal and the codex in which every observation recorded along the path would accumulate into a narrative Tayasal had not encountered before. The inland trails wound through a mosaic of ecosystems. Dense forest patches alternated with open savannas where the sun pressed heavily on the grasses. Bird calls echoed with variations in pitch that shifted subtly as altitude changed. The land carried its own signatures, the way tree roots arched across paths, the scent of soil dampened by hidden springs, the flight patterns of herons rising in loose spirals from marshes. An astronomer's training sharpens the eye for pattern, and everywhere I looked, I saw the land expressing alignments no less complex than those mapped in the sky. At each village we passed, we were received with quiet courtesy. People offered water and shade beneath thatched communal roofs, and while they were not told the full purpose of our journey, they sensed enough to ask oblique questions about Tayasal's well-being. I gave careful, measured answers. Nothing I reported would contradict the king's composure. Yet even without explicit knowledge, rural communities felt the slight tremors of change. Stories drift more quickly along riverbanks than official messages do along palace corridors. Along the trail, I continued my measurements. The length of shadows at midday differed by predictable ratios from those in Tayasal, confirming our change in latitude. The sun's declination shifted fractionally day by day as it moved along its seasonal path. Atmospheric clarity fluctuated with the humidity rising from the marshes, creating distortions that required annotated correction in the codex. Even when traveling, the work of the House of Instruments remained uninterrupted. Measurement is not bound to walls. The closer we approached the coast, the more the land announced its proximity to the sea. The forest canopy lowered slightly, the trees widening at their bases as if bracing against storms. The scent of salt entered the air, faint at first, then unmistakable. The sound of distant waves traveled inland as a muted drumbeat. Mangrove roots began to appear along water channels, their tangled forms emerging from reflective surfaces that mirrored the sky with eerie precision. When we reached the first coastal settlement, the transition felt almost ceremonial. Houses stood elevated on stilts to guard against tidal surges. Fishermen's nets hung from wooden frames to dry in the sun. The rhythm of life here was dictated by tides rather than lake cycles. While the people recognized us as emissaries from the inland capital, it was clear they operated with knowledge shaped by forces Tayasal rarely experienced. Winds that could rise suddenly, storms that reshaped shorelines overnight, currents strong enough to alter the trajectory of driftwood far from its origin. The trader in our group introduced us to the settlement's leader, who welcomed us into a shaded gathering space overlooking the inlet. From this vantage point, I observed the contour of the shoreline and the geometry of the distant horizon. It was here that fishermen had reported faint lights that moved neither like stars nor like the reflections of clouds caught in the water's surface. Their stories were detailed enough to merit attention, but restrained enough to suggest sincerity rather than embellishment. The leader produced fragments of driftwood that had washed ashore. When placed before me, they bore characteristics immediately distinct from local materials. Thicker grain, paler color, heavier mass. Iron nails protruded from the wood, longer than any crafted by Maya smiths, hammered through the planks with force and technique foreign to our methods. The evidence was tangible, not a whisper of imagination. I documented each fragment with drawings and glyphic notation. As dusk fell that evening, I positioned myself at the eastern shoreline to observe the horizon directly. The sea here was an expanse that extended beyond the limits of mapped experience. Our people navigated coastal routes and river mouths with skill, But they did not venture beyond the protective reefs where the waters deepened into unknown territories. Looking across the darkening waves, I felt the same sensation I had felt when first learning astronomy, the awareness that distance can hide not only objects, but entire realities. The sky shifted to indigo, stars sharpened. The fisherman who guided me pointed toward the region where previous lights had appeared. I steadied my gaze, focusing past the horizon's curvature. For long minutes, I saw nothing beyond the expected glint of stars. Then, faintly, so faintly that it would have been easy to dismiss, a distant flicker touched the line where sky and water met. It did not move like starlight. It did not pulse like lightning. It appeared, vanished, reappeared, slightly displaced. A signature too deliberate to be atmospheric. I marked its bearing in my codex and measured the angle of its elevation. The reading was small, but real. More testimony awaited farther to the north, so we continued our journey along the coastline. The next settlement presented similar accounts: lights at sea, patterns of driftwood, and in one case, the faint echo of sound carried across waves, deep, rhythmic, unlike the wind or the movement of canoes. Though none of these observations alone would have warranted alarm, their accumulation formed a pattern too coherent to dismiss. Fishermen described a distant shape they believed to be a wall rising from the water, tall enough to catch the reflection of the dawn light. I asked for elaboration, but the descriptions remained cautious. They had seen only silhouettes against a sky still dark. This unfamiliar object did not approach the reef, but moved parallel to it, drifting northward as though carried by currents or propelled by forces they could not interpret. As I traced these testimonies onto the codex, a realization settled over me. The anomalies in Venus's cycle and the anomalies in the sea were unlikely to be unrelated. Both exhibited subtle shifts, neither catastrophic nor dismissible. The world was signaling change, not in a single event, but in a series of quiet deviations. Traveling inland toward Tayasal, I revisited my measurements. The consistency of the Venus deviation became clearer when compared to the coastal readings. The foreign wood weighed heavily in my pack, a physical artifact of an unknown presence. My mind turned repeatedly to Aj Khan X's manner when first shown the deviation. Calm, thoughtful, prepared for complexity. When we reached the lake again, Tayasal appeared as it always had, rising from the water in steady lines of plaster and stone. Yet I returned not as the observer who had left, but as one who carried evidence that the boundaries of our world were shifting. The palace waited. The king would listen, not for fear, not for superstition, but for knowledge. The Khan Ek lineage had survived because it understood that cycles bend before they break, and patterns reveal themselves before consequences unfold. My role was not to interpret, but to record, to offer clarity where uncertainty had begun to spread. As I stepped once more onto the central landing of Tayasal and felt the familiar give of the plaster beneath my sandals, the lake at my back, and the palace before me, I understood the full weight of what I carried. The sky had spoken first, the sea had answered, and now the kingdom would need to reckon with what both had begun to reveal. This was no longer a journey of verification. It had become the opening of a new cycle, one whose end none of us could yet see, but whose first signs had already entered the codex under my hand. Chapter 3. The King's Dilemma. When I returned from the eastern coast, Tayasal appeared unchanged on the surface, yet beneath its orderly rhythms, I sensed a new tension, subtle but unmistakable, like a faint vibration carried through stone when something heavy moves at a distance. The lake still lay calm each morning, reflecting temples and houses in its polished surface, the market still filled with traders arranging their goods under woven mats. The priests continued their ceremonies as predictably as the sunrise. But the people moved with a quiet sharpness, as though attuned to some unspoken shift. Carrying the foreign wood and measurements across the landing, I felt an awareness settling upon me. Tayasal, the last great Maya capital, stood at the threshold of a cycle that had begun to bend. Not break, just bend. A subtle change, but changes of this type never remained small. The king received my report with the steadiness expected of the Khan-Ek lineage. The foreign driftwood, the iron nails, the coastal testimony of tall shapes at sea, the faint horizon lights. Each piece entered his mind without visible reaction, absorbed into the larger matrix of understanding that structured his rule. The Venus deviation alone had drawn his attention. Combined with the coastal signs, it formed a pattern that required both silence and vigilance. He convened councils not to announce fear, but to gather perspectives. Priests considered the signs through the language of cycles, referencing earlier codices that spoke of rising suns and wandering visitors whose identities were preserved only in symbolic form. Military captains evaluated the strategic meaning of disturbances near the coast. Traders described variations in current and tide unusual for the season. I attended these councils not as a decision-maker, but as a recorder. My duty was to provide geometric clarity where interpretations threatened to blur. In the House of Instruments, we learned that the sky is patient, and so must we be. Yet as the deliberations unfolded, it became clear that patience would soon require action. The first directive came from the king quietly. A new codex was to be created dedicated solely to the anomalies. No embellishment, no interpretation, only facts. The codex would remain private until its usefulness became evident. I began copying the records with the type of attention that tightens the breath. Each glyph carried weight, not ceremonial weight, but documentary weight, the weight of something recorded because future readers would need it. In these weeks, I observed the city with sharpened sensibility. Tayasal's plazas had always moved on cyclical rhythms shaped by markets, rituals, migrations, and planting seasons. Now the rhythms carried an undertone of expectation. Priests burned incense more frequently before sunrise. Fishermen delayed their departures, watching the lake longer than usual. Children, sensing adult unease without understanding the source, played less energetically near the water's edge. The lake itself remained placid, but its placidity felt less innocent. I had stood at its banks since childhood, tracking stars mirrored on its surface, memorizing the ways wind disturbed or calmed it. Now, observing the water, I felt as though it were listening. One night, after completing lunar measurements, I ascended the observatory's eastern platform to verify the angle of Venus in the pre-dawn sky. The city lay silent, its torches reduced to faint embers. As I prepared my instruments, I noticed movement along the shoreline. A canoe, drifting freely, its silhouette faint under moonlight. Such sightings were common. Moorings sometimes slipped, but as it approached the embankment, I noticed its markings. A burned spiral symbol unfamiliar to Tayasal or any nearby community.
Soon after, another canoe appeared, then a third. All drifting, all unoccupied, all carrying markings not associated with local lineages. Their arrival was quiet, almost gentle, as though carried by a current I could not detect. This event entered the codex not as an omen, but as an anomaly deserving classification. Foreign driftwood from the sea now found its inland counterpart in unfamiliar canoes across the lake. Though no dialogue was spoken about it in Tayasal's plazas, news traveled through posture and glance. The kingdom had begun to absorb the implications. The unknown was approaching, and it approached from more than one direction. The king reviewed my updated codex pages with a gravity that signaled the emergence of a new phase of governance.
He did not publicly announce concerns, for leadership here operates through stability, not alarm. Yet privately, he requested additional patrols along the lake's tributaries, better monitoring of water channels, and quiet observation of communities whose trade routes touched the northern wetlands. Days passed with attention woven into familiar routines. Sunrise measurements continued, shadow lengths tracked their seasonal arc, and the codex filled with details that might one day form the core of historical memory. I found myself watching the sky with greater attention, not because Venus deviated dramatically, it did not, but because its subtle deviations now felt like part of a broader conversation between celestial and earthly realms. The eclipse approached during this period, one predicted generations earlier in tables carefully preserved by astronomers before my time. Eclipse days carry significance in our tradition not because they foretell change, but because they reveal the precision of the sky's deeper structure. The morning of the eclipse, Tayasal gathered in expectant formation around the plazas and temple steps. The sun dimmed gradually, shadows dissolved into soft halos, and for a brief interval the light itself seemed to thin, as if filtered through the ages. I took measurements from the observatory platform, shadow lengths, brightness decline, horizon contrast. The data fitted the predictions well, an anchor of consistency amidst the growing field of anomalies. Yet the people below perceived the day differently. Any bending of light, any disturbance of natural order felt heavier now than it would have months earlier. The priests responded with ritual steadiness, burning incense in broad spirals of smoke that rose straight into the dimmed sky. The eclipse ended as expected, but its symbolism, as with all natural events interpreted at the turning of cycles, amplified the city's underlying anxiety. In the days that followed, the king convened smaller, more focused councils. The tone became quieter, more deliberate. He sought clarity from astronomers, weather watchers, scouts, and elders who remembered older stories carried orally before writing took its current form. All knowledge streams met in his chamber. He listened with an attentiveness that itself formed a kind of leadership. What emerged from these deliberations was not a conclusion, but a direction. Tayasal would observe more closely. It would strengthen its internal lines of communication. It would refrain from signaling uncertainty to its allies or rivals. And it would continue measuring the sky precisely, because the sky, even when shifting, offered structure. Then came the night that would shape the remainder of this chapter. I had returned to the observatory after dark to verify calculations related to the eclipse. The city lay quiet. A faint breeze stirred the torchlight along the palace causeway. As I stepped onto the eastern platform, I heard a low, deep sound crossing the lake, so subtle at first that I questioned whether it was merely an echo of distant thunder. But thunder does not repeat at such regular intervals. The sound pulsed slowly, with weight behind it. Something heavy moved through water beyond the limits of torchlight.
It was not a canoe. It was not an animal. The cadence was too steady, too deliberate. I waited, listening. The sound continued for several breaths, then faded. Moments later, flocks of birds rose abruptly from the marshlands, circling in disordered patterns before dispersing into the night. This event entered the codex with the same neutrality as the foreign driftwood and the Venus deviations, yet writing the glyphs carried a gravity deeper than any previous record. The lake had become a participant in the pattern. The sound, though not understood, belonged to the same sequence of anomalies. Soon after, the king called me privately. He reviewed the codex again, slowly, tracing the glyphs of each observation with quiet reflection. In his face, I saw not fear, but acknowledgement. A clarity born of leadership, trained across generations to interpret shifts in cycles, not by panic, but by continuity. He requested that I prepare a second codex, one that would remain hidden until a time when the anomalies resolved into a clearer picture. This directive expanded the responsibility of my role beyond present observation into the realm of future memory. The codex would serve as a record, not merely of what we had seen, but of how Tayasal had responded when the world first signaled its transformation. Throughout this period, the city's daily rhythms continued outwardly unchanged, masking an inner vigilance. The lake glimmered at sunrise. The markets opened and closed. Ritual fires burned with their usual precision. Yet everyone felt a slight shift in weight, as if the city itself leaned toward a horizon none of us had yet seen. My work intensified. I measured, recorded, compared, analyzed. I walked the plazas at dawn and dusk, watching the interplay of water, sky, and human movement. I returned repeatedly to the observatory, whose windows framed the horizon like pages of a codex waiting to be filled. As the chapter closed, I understood the nature of the king's dilemma: to maintain stability while preparing for the unprecedented, to anchor the present while documenting the arrival of a future whose outlines were only faintly visible. The cycle had begun to bend, and Tayasal stood at its fulcrum. The codex I kept became the ledger of that bending. 4. The last dawn of the old counting. In the final weeks of that turning season, the city of Tayasal moved through its routines with a steadiness that appeared, at first glance, indistinguishable from any other year. The plazas filled each morning with merchants arranging fruit and pottery under woven mats. Fishermen pushed their canoes from the lake's edge at dawn and returned by midday with nets of shimmering fish. The temple terraces echoed with ritual chants timed to the solar calendar. Yet beneath every action lay a growing attentiveness, an instinctive tightening of awareness that spread quietly through the population. People spoke less freely and listened more deeply. Even the children played closer to their families, as if drawn toward the center by some intangible shift in gravity. The king did not speak publicly of concern, nor did he alter the rituals of governance. Instead, he acted through structure, expanding the network of watchers assigned to the lake, encouraging priests to review older codices, asking traders to record unusual stories in their travel logs. He understood that the perception of stability was essential, even if the kingdom's inner calculations had changed. The Itza had endured because they knew how to hold stillness over shifting ground. For my part, the work in the House of Instruments entered its most intense phase. The codex dedicated to the anomalies neared completion. Pages filled rapidly with measured glyphs: the deviation of Venus, the driftwood from the coast, the foreign nails, the testimonies of fishermen, the arrival of unmarked canoes on our lake, the faint sounds that rippled across water at night. None of these elements formed a complete picture, yet together they suggested a systemic disturbance. I wrote without speculation, letting the precision of data speak in place of interpretation. Outside the observatory, the sky moved steadily through its cycles. The sun progressed along its seasonal arc, shortening shadows day by day. The moon followed its familiar phases. When the predicted eclipse arrived, its partial coverage of the sun became a moment of communal attention. The diminished light cast an unusual stillness across the plazas, and the silence of birds amplified the feeling that nature itself had paused. People responded not with fear, but with reverence. Eclipses were expected in our tables, and their occurrence affirmed the reliability of the sky, a reassuring counterpoint to the uncertainty growing upon earth and water. Yet even this confirmation of celestial order could not conceal the other signs. When the eclipse passed and life resumed, the conversations among elders and priests grew quieter, more reflective. Older stories were revisited, stories from codices or from oral memory describing eras when unusual travelers approached from directions not associated with established trade routes. These accounts were never detailed enough to offer clarity, but their recurrence in the minds of the priests suggested that the past had begun to resonate with the present. The king summoned me often during this period, not for dramatic announcements, but for calibration of understanding. He inquired about the persistence of Venus's deviation, the consistency of shadow lengths, the clarity of the horizon. He had the manner of someone who sought structure in a time of unfolding complexity. A ruler in such a position does not seek prophecy. He seeks clarity, because clarity is the closest thing to control when the world begins to tilt. As the lake played an increasingly central role in these observations, I found myself studying it with renewed attentiveness. In Tayasal, water is not merely a geographic feature. It is a medium of communication, a mirror for the sky, a pathway for traders, and an anchor for the kingdom's identity. The lake has moods, patterns, behaviors, and currents that an observer learns over years of watching. Now, subtle irregularities appeared, currents moving in directions unusual for the season, surface tension disturbed by forces not attributable to wind. These were small shifts, but small shifts sometimes signal larger forces. The counselors closest to the king began meeting with greater frequency. Their discussions were deliberate and often extended late into the night. Though I did not attend all of them, the tone of those I observed reflected a heightened sense of responsibility. Leaders debated the implications of the anomalies without allowing fear to enter the chamber. The Khan-ek tradition demands measured response, particularly in times of uncertainty. Emotion distorts cycles. Only precision preserves them. As these meetings continued, I worked steadily to complete the codex. Each section served as a ledger of one dimension of the disturbances: sky, sea, lake, testimony, material evidence. The process of writing grounded me, as it had always done. To transcribe an observation into glyphic form requires full presence. Stroke by stroke, the uncertainty of the world becomes structured thought. When the codex neared completion, I prepared the final pages with an awareness that they would represent not an ending, but the foundation for understanding a cycle not yet visible. One night, after completing a series of calculations relating the Venus deviation to the changing length of dawn shadows, I ascended the observatory platform for a final reading before rest. The city was quiet, its torches burning low. The moon cast a broad path of light across the lake, creating an almost ethereal glow over the water. For a long moment, nothing stirred, and the quiet felt profound, as though the world were holding its breath. Then, faintly at first, I heard it again, the low, distant rhythmic sound I had recorded earlier in the codex. It traveled across the lake with a weight beneath it, a resonance too sustained to be natural wind movement. The sound pulsed softly, disappearing and reappearing as though something massive shifted just beyond the reach of the moonlight. I stood motionless, listening until the sound tapered into silence. A cluster of birds rose abruptly from the reeds moments later, their silhouettes dissolving into the night sky. The lake's surface rippled near the marshlands, the disturbance spreading slowly outward. I marked the location in my mind and noted the time by the moon's position. This event differed from the earlier one only in its slightly closer proximity. Whatever moved in the water was approaching, but not directly. Rather, it followed a route along outer channels. The next morning, I delivered the near-completed codex to the king. He reviewed its pages with the focused stillness that characterized his leadership. His face expressed no fear, no alarm, only recognition. When he reached the final entries, he paused for a long moment before closing the codex with deliberate care. He then requested that I begin a second codex, one intended not for immediate reference, but for preservation. This new volume would contain a distilled account of the anomalies from an astronomer's perspective, to be secured for future generations. I understood the significance. A king asks for a preserved codex only when he believes the world stands at the threshold of historical transformation.
While I began work on this second codex, Tayasal continued its outward routines. Priests prepared for seasonal ceremonies, traders returned from distant villages with goods and stories, and the lake glimmered in the shifting light of sunrise. Yet beneath this continuity lay a collective awareness that something approached, not through roads, not through alliances, but through forces whose full shape remained concealed. A few days after I began the new codex, the king summoned me again. This time, he asked to meet at the observatory platform after sunset. The sky was clear when we arrived. Venus hung in sharp brilliance just above the horizon, its position confirming the deviation I had documented for weeks. The lake lay smooth and reflective, its surface mirroring the fading light. The king stood beside me, gazing outward across the water. He asked for no instruments and sought no specific measurements. Instead, he observed the horizon with the depth of someone who recognized that his kingdom stood inside a turning cycle whose next stage was emerging beyond known boundaries. As the moon rose higher, the faint, rhythmic sound returned, soft, distant, unmistakable. The king listened without reaction, absorbing the sound as another piece of the growing pattern. When it faded, he turned slightly, the light catching the Serpent-Star motif of his mantle. He told me then, in the quiet tone of one acknowledging a truth long considered, that the cycle of the known world was shifting in ways the Itza had prepared for in their codices, but had not witnessed in living memory. The reason for the shift remained concealed, but its presence was undeniable. He instructed me to finish the second codex promptly, and to prepare it for preservation beyond the palace, somewhere safe, inaccessible to immediate disturbance, yet reachable for future scholars who might need to understand how this cycle began. I understood without further explanation. The king foresaw change not only in nature, but in the fate of Tayasal itself. Following this meeting, I completed the codex with renewed focus. I wrote until dawn, painted the observatory walls with pale gold. When I set down my stylus after the final glyph, I sensed, in a way difficult to articulate, that the closing of the codex mirrored the closing of an era. Tayasal remained serene. The temples still caught the first light of day. The lake still shimmered in its mosaic of blue. But the stillness now felt like the surface of a deep tide preparing to shift. Every observation affirmed the same truth. The cycle of the old counting was reaching its final dawn. When I stepped outside with the codex wrapped securely for preservation, the lake breeze carried the faintest echoes of distant movement. I turned toward the horizon and saw nothing but calm water. Yet I knew, because the sky had spoken, the sea had answered, and the lake had begun to respond, that something approached our world. The first signs were subtle, they always are. But once a cycle bends, it never returns unchanged.